part, his experience of that kind of independent congregationalist piety of the Baptist church, but definitely polity, I should say, the congregationalist polity, but definitely that union of heat and light with the preaching and the piety of the black church in America.
Heat and light.
Isn't that good?
Combo.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he takes that with him back to Germany, and he this time, for all of his what bridges on chauvinism about Lutheranism, he begins to see the state evangelisch, like the state Protestant church, capitulate to Nazism. And he sees in some cases the swastika being put up in the sanctuary of these churches. And he just does not understand how Christians are allowing this to happen. And some Bonhoeffer scholars say it destroys his faith in the church. And so he, with several others, Martin Niemöller is a famous one, starts an underground movement in an underground seminary that in English is called the Confessing Church, where they undertake to train clergy and to give an alternative to clergy to the state Lutheran and Reformed Church. And this goes a long way. This is where he writes his book, Life Together, his little meditation on faith and community. And eventually this is stymied and broken up by the Nazi secret police. Bonhoeffer he wrestles in his own heart, in some of his writings, with the ethics of participating in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And
he was arrested under suspicion of the July 20th plot?
I don't remember. I'd have to go back and look.
Okay.
But he's definitely, his name was on the list. And so he's arrested, and he's put into the Flossenburg prison. I think it was the Tegel prison to begin with, and he's transferred to Flossenburg. And so for, I think, more than 2 years, he's in prison, and the writings we have from him are notes and letters. And that's where he develops, largely in the year 1944, he writes in a lot of letters about a religionless Christianity. And by that he means a Christianity that is devoted to Christ and that is devoted to Scripture, but does not have, but has been sort of freed of or pulled away from the I don't want to say like the formal structures, because that's not quite that, but what he's wrestling with is essentially how can Christianity possibly survive this capitulation to what is clearly a totalitarian regime. Now, Bonhoeffer at that time did not know the extent of the Nazi plot to exterminate Jews.
Few people did.
Yeah. Because the Nazis were very, very good at controlling the spread of information. But he had his suspicions, and so he writes in prison a lot about the question of the problem of evil, and his answer is that God is not doing anything about this because God has chosen to be powerless in the world as Christ is powerless in the world, and to be present and most powerfully present among the powerless. It's a kind of paradoxical. It's completely understandable why he's reaching for this, and there's a lot, obviously, in his experience that would lead him to that conclusion, because go ahead. Yeah.
Did he? You mentioned that he wished to have a church devoted to Christ and devoted to the Bible, but sort of free from a structure. Some structure, I think, is inevitable and necessary for the church, but I think when a structure has to coexist with a regime that extreme
Yes.
and that evil, I imagine they made some concessions out of fear for their own survival, so he didn't want a church bound to that type of
Yeah, I mean,
structure.
that's exactly right. And I wish I could call them on some of the sentences in those letters, but Bonhoeffer is interestingly enough, he's more influential in the fullness of time in the United States than he is in Germany. And the Bonhoeffer sense of how you can start to even approach that question of why God allows evil to exist is a very compelling one. He writes often about the essence of Christ is Christ's being for others. Christ emptying himself, in the language of Paul in the letter to the Philippians, taking on the form of a slave. And this kind of being for others is a really, I think it's a great place to start with thinking about how to be Christian today. And one of the so Bonhoeffer outlines some of the things he'd like to try to write when he gets out of prison, though of course tragically he was murdered before he could do that. But one